So at this point in time, I'm going to introduce Joyce Briggs, who is the Executive Director for ACC&D.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you for doing those two polls. I am so pleased you all came, and I am so pleased you all watched the video. So thanks so much. I'm Joyce. I'm the president of the Alliance for Contraception in Cats and Dogs, and my primary role here is really just to set up the session and introduce our panelists. So as I think most of you probably know, ACC&D really focuses most on advancing non-surgical sterilization options for cats and dogs. And we've really had a pretty recent strong focus on cats, and free-roaming cats are a big part and a reason of that. The computer simulation modeling we've done originated as a way to understand what alternative profiles of treatments might be worthwhile advancing, specifically looking at a 3-year contraceptive. And that expanded into looking at information because we realized that there was very little of this kind of work done to help us use surgery more strategically and better. So we've been doing that for now a number of years. We've published 2 papers and about to submit a 3rd. And when COVID hit, as did many of you, we looked for how could we contribute and during this unusual and distressing time. And one of the things we did was look hard at what accessible and available contraceptives could be used during this emergency spay gap. And that's not our main topic, but I'm here for questions on that if you have them, probably at the end. The other way we felt like we could contribute was to take all of this learning we had through modeling and look what happened in this possible gap. And today we're going to talk about the modeling with the video as a basis. So I'm glad so many of you watched it. But we'll also hope to provide some more perspective on the modeling work and answer your questions as best possible. On this format, we're not able to play the video, but I've got the PowerPoint accessible, and that is the basis of that, and I can pull up slides or graphs that you may have some specific questions on. So I am really pleased to have the expertise that this panel brings. I'm going to do a brief introduction of each of the panelists, and I'll encourage them to add anything they'd like to share. My intro will mostly share the skills and participation that I and ACC&D really value and appreciate from them. So one of our panelists is Dr. Margaret Slater. She is a veterinary epidemiologist, so she's very accustomed to looking at animals at the population level. And she has studied and published really widely on free-roaming cats for over 20 years. When ACC&D first started looking at options for a multi-year contraceptive, Margaret and a colleague of hers did some mathematical modeling looking at a 3-year contraceptive published back in 2009. And it really started all of this work out. She has been on our committee since and is co-author of the publications I've mentioned. And the ASPCA has been really helpful educating through ASPCA Pro. Margaret's currently on our scientific advisory board, where she's been for over a decade. Our second panelist is Dr. John Boone, and John got really, I'll describe it as hooked into this modeling work when he was exposed to Margaret's study and invited as a guest to our 2010 symposium. He is a wildlife biologist with a specialization on applied conservation issues and has a deep knowledge about population biology, and was excited about some new kinds of modeling technology he thought could really advance what we were doing. During the day, he's a research director of the Global Basin Bird Observatory, and he's a really unique guy in that he's served as a board member of the Reno SPCA, or SPCA of Northern Nevada, for 18 years. So he's clearly got a foot in both of the fields, and I very much appreciate that he looks to how to bridge those worlds for where there's mutual interest. He has served on our modeling committee the entire time, on our scientific advisory board, and is now on our board of directors. So our third panelist is Peter Wolf, who I think many of you know maybe pretty well. He's the Cat Initiatives Research and Policy Analyst for Best Friends. And he's really been a leader in the development and operation of community cat programs. I love that Peter's role has so involved the analysis of science and public policy related to community cat issues. He's been writing and researching this for quite a long time. In fact, I just read this weekend his newest published piece on managing free-roaming cats in U.S. cities, an object lesson in public policy and citizen action, importantly published in the Journal of Urban Affairs. We particularly relish how Peter is a data geek like a lot of our folks and does a really good job of interpreting the data and the research as it affects the people in the field and policymakers. So I did have scheduled for my coworker to show up on this. You'll probably see here, she's just about to walk through the screen. But anyway, so what we're going to do is we will have our policy or our panelists each talk. We're going to start with John Boone, who's going to talk about kind of the key points of the video and the modeling, important parts about the modeling that's underneath that. Then we'll shift to Peter to really help integrate that to the local approach. And then we'll wrap up with Margaret, who's going to bring us back to objectives of TNR and what learning there is for how to manage those. So with no further ado, I'll hand it to John. To Dr. John Boone.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to my basement. As Joyce said, I'm going to just briefly recap what I see as a few of the main points, the most fundamental points of this ACC&D effort as a basis for moving on to the other panelists. First, I would start by mentioning that every group of cats out there that all of you are working with is a little bit different from every other group of cats. Some of them are very different. So no model, including the one that we have created, is capable of predicting exactly what's going to happen in every situation. And that's why the ACC&D group and others are always saying, if you really want to know what's going on with your local population, you need to observe them and preferably measure them in a more formal way. But what models can do is to give us an idea of how these relatively complicated systems are likely to behave under a given set of circumstances. And our goal here was just to do that. It was to give us an idea of how a typical outdoor cat population is likely to react if TNR efforts get shut down for some period of time because of COVID or because of something else. And really there are two basic answers to that question. And so I'll ask you to imagine these two scenarios sequentially. In the first case, imagine that you've managed to do enough TNR of your cat population. Let's just, for the sake of argument, say it's 100 cats that you're focusing on. You've sterilized enough of them that your population has started to go down, and in fact has gone down fairly substantially. Now, I think we all know, based on discussions and research over the years, that in order to get a cat population to go down, we need to sterilize a fairly significant majority of cats, specifically female cats. So let's just imagine that of those 100 cats, we've sterilized 80% of them, and that because of that, that population has gone down to, oh, I don't know, let's just say 50 or so. Now, at that point in time, only 20% of the females in that population of 50, so 25 females out of the 50 that remain, only about 20% of them are actually still fertile at a given typical period of time. If we have a spay gap at that point, we've only got a fairly small number of females that are capable of starting the process of rebuilding that population. And they will start that process. But the fact that there are relatively few of them means that it's not going to take off as fast as we might inherently fear that it might. Compare that situation to a little bit different situation where a cat population has been reduced to 50 from 100 by just suddenly removing 50% of the cats. No sterilization, just removing the cats. In that case, we've got 25 fertile females that will go to work trying to rebuild that population as soon as the spay gap starts, compared to 4 or 5 cats. It doesn't take much advanced math to see that one of those scenarios is going to go a lot faster than the other. So that's one of the outcomes. If you've got a high level of sterilization, your population will start to regrow if there's a spay gap, but it's not going to happen very fast, typically, because you've already limited the number of females that are available to undertake that work. The other scenario is one where you have not achieved such a high sterilization rate. And this involves remembering that even though cats can have a lot of kittens, and even though in theory the number of cats could grow forever, it never actually does. Something stops a group of outdoor cats from growing and growing perpetually. And that thing is something that we call carrying capacity. It's a term that encompasses a whole lot of different processes like available food and shelter and weather conditions and competition. And we don't always know how carrying capacity really works, but we know that it's there because in most cases, a cat population that you start to address with TNR is probably somewhere near its carrying capacity. That's where it settles in if it's given a little bit of time. Now, if you've done some meaningful TNR work on that population, but not yet enough to make those numbers go down, when you have a spay gap, yes, more kittens will be born, but the carrying capacity, it's what's keeping that population of cats from growing at that point. So in either of these cases that I've described, what we don't have is the situation that we sometimes hear about if you put 2 cats on an island with lots of food and nothing there to limit their growth, and they grow geometrically. In both of the cases I've described, there are factors in place to keep that worst case scenario from occurring. So bottom line, obviously a spay gap's not a desirable thing, but if it lasts on the order of time of about a year, we don't see, based on this modeling, a sort of a worst case scenario starting to develop in most cases. Again, remember that there can be exceptional cases here and there because we don't know everything about every cat population. So that's sort of a recap of the fundamental points. And I think the other one is that when it comes time to try to make up whatever ground we've lost to the spay gap, as always, in the longer term, you're going to get more bang for your buck if you can devote the resources to getting your sterilization rate up high relatively quickly. That's what we call front loading. Many of you have heard us use that term. Obviously, you do it as quickly as you can, and there are circumstances that dictate how fast you can do it. But the faster you can do it, the more that will pay off over the long run in terms of your outcomes and the amount of effort you have to spend to get to where you want to go. So with that, I think we pass it over to my friend Peter, who will bring this back down to the kind of the field implementation level, I believe.
All right, as John mentioned, what I wanted to talk about, so as much as the panelists here are really interested in looking at population modeling and really getting into the weeds on stuff like this, I realize that's not everybody's cup of tea. And as it happens, I'm involved with the TNR project in a nearby neighborhood. That kind of maybe that example will ground for other folks on the call today what this looks like and how it's similar to what the modeling has shown, and in those areas where it sort of seems to deviate from the model, kind of talk a little bit about why that might be the case. So in a nutshell, it's a neighborhood where a lot of TNR has been done over the last few years, very successfully. This particular pocket, though, has been a real challenge, and what we've come to find out was, we surmised this kind of early on, but then we were able to confirm this. We are not very successful trapping cats in this particular pocket because somebody was feeding. And for those of you who do trapping, you know that can be very frustrating. The cats just aren't hungry. They're not going to go into the traps. It makes it very difficult. Thankfully, when we found this individual who was feeding, we discovered she also had a very detailed spreadsheet of all the cats, and she'd been keeping very careful records. and was actually reaching out for help at the same time we found her. So this was all for the good. What we learned was 24 cats in total. Let's see here, 10 of which were female. Prior to the shutdown, and I should mention, I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. Our shutdown wasn't complete, first of all, but we lost a lot of clinic appointments, mostly in April. So we were in there trapping pretty intensively February and March, and there were 24 cats, 15 of which were sterilized prior to the shutdown. So that puts us at 63%, not quite at the 75% that you saw referenced in the modeling video, but we're doing quite well. And again, this is that front loading that John just mentioned. Go in there, you know, as quickly as you can, get as many cats sterilized. And we really lucked out because 10 of the 24, only 10 of the 24 were female, right? So in general, we generally assume it's about a 50-50 split. So we got lucky, only 10 were female. Where we didn't get so lucky were, and I should mention, before the shutdown, 7 of the 10 females were sterilized. So again, we're in good shape. But as soon as the shutdown happened, all 3 of the unsterilized females gave birth. So immediately we're on plan B instead of plan A, get them all fixed and prevent the birth. We're asking ourselves, okay, now what do we do? And we've been very lucky in this situation. This is not, I appreciate this is not everyone's situation. We've got 3 fosters for the kittens, and we have rescue outcomes for the kittens. So we've gone in there, we're pulling as many kittens as we can. There's still a few holdouts. If it comes down to it, those will remain with this group of cats, and they will be trapped and sterilized when they're a little bit older. But for now, the plan is still pull 100% of the recently born kittens in there. So again, on the one hand, there's some parallels to the modeling. On the other hand, the model doesn't necessarily assume that all of the unsterilized females will become pregnant and give birth virtually all at the same time. It's also the case that being in Phoenix, where I am, our kitten season starts early, as you might imagine. And that meant, in terms of coinciding with the pandemic and those shutdowns, it was really bad timing for us. Some other folks maybe had another month or even 2 months before kitten season really starts in earnest. The other thing, just a few other kind of takeaways from this experience. Again, on the one hand, there's some bad news there, right? As soon as these kittens are born, we're scrambling to, again, get them into foster homes, get them into rescues for positive outcomes. On the other hand, we know from some of those early spays of pregnant females, we know how many kittens they would have been born, plus the ones that actually were born during the shutdown. And what those numbers tell us is this one pocket in this little neighborhood just south of me was about to go from 24 resident cats to 50 resident cats. Now, to be clear, if there's no intervention, it's unlikely all the kittens would have survived. It's also likely some of the adults, as density increased, some of the adults may have moved on. So again, this gets to the carrying capacity concept that John just mentioned. Not saying that there would have been 50 cats today in that neighborhood, but I can tell you there's some residents there who already had kind of lost their patience. Had we gone from 24 to 50 cats, I don't know that we would have broken through the carrying capacity, but we definitely would have tested the patience of those residents. And then, of course, it's important to keep in mind too, we're talking about a spay gap due to the pandemic and those shutdowns, but many of us have experienced similar interruptions in service, whether it's because grant funding fell through, our trapping buddy is ill, or they moved away maybe. So and all of that applies here. It's just an interruption of service. In this case, it happened to been due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the final point I would just want to make is, and I think this has little to do with the population modeling itself, but it gets to the importance of intensity and the front loading that John mentioned in this case, and I think it's kind of a common scenario, personal relationships really were the key. Until we built those relationships with a couple key individuals, and really it was one person who then kind of built those additional bridges with neighbors, we weren't making much headway in this particular pocket. But as soon as we were able to locate that individual, have a conversation with them, immediately we were able to take a great deal more action. And I think this is something we often overlook, or we maybe don't fully realize the importance in animal welfare is those personal relationships, the door knocking, talking to neighbors, even if they're the neighbors who are frustrated with the cats. Again, in this particular case, those relationships are what allowed us to really break through and get as much done as we did prior to the pandemic. Had we not connected those dots in time, we would have been looking at those 50 cats and however many of them survived. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Margaret.
Hi, everybody. So you've heard a little bit about the models. You've heard a little bit about something on a street corner that will resonate for many of you. And I want to just note that those relationships that Peter's was talking about are going to be really important when you're trying to figure out the goals of the work. If you're just looking at a couple of cats in your backyard, then that may be your goal, is to just deal with that small group of cats. But if you're an organization, or if you're a trapper, or you're working with multiple people, multiple locations of cats, then there's going to be some kind of a goal that you have to set. And the goal, or clearly one of the goals that Peter and the group had for the colony he was talking about, was to get in there and get as many cats sterilized in as short a period of time as they could possibly manage, so that they could do this front loading. There are a lot of goals that people have when it comes down to doing TNR. In some cases, it's doing X number of surgeries if you're a clinic, or being solvent. Sometimes it's decreasing intake to shelters, or decreasing kittens in your area. Sometimes it's nuisance complaints that you're trying to address. And we have a tendency to sometimes not make our goals explicit and not make them longer term. It's very much can be this cat right in front of me right now, and not necessarily about prioritizing or targeting or thinking through, is what we're trying to do decrease the population of cats? So I've heard a lot that there are a lot of people are concerned. John has explained this idea of carrying capacity. And one of the points I want to make is that in some cases, while we're hoping that our TNR here and that our spay neuter here and there in different groups of cats is decreasing the population, the reality is that it may not be. We may not be doing enough spay neuter in a given group of cats to really decrease the numbers of cats in that group in the long term, or we may not be doing it intensively enough, front-loaded enough, so that the population's really going to decline to a lower level, and there will be fewer cats in the group, fewer kittens born, and all of those things. When you have fewer cats in the population, there are fewer cats at risk of the risks that outdoor cats have, of traffic and other kinds of things. There are fewer kittens born, and when fewer kittens are born, there are fewer kittens who die, because kitten mortality on the street can be fairly high depending on their location. When there are fewer cats in the population, which you accomplish by doing this higher intensity front-loaded TNR, when there are fewer kittens, you also have less adults, and those adults that you have are spayed or neutered sooner, and we know that that can also improve their health. They gain weight, their coat quality improves, they just tend to do better, and they're not at risk. They tend to roam less, there's less fighting, those kinds of things that increase injuries. We also know that sterilization is a great tool if you're dealing with nuisance complaints, because it decreases the spraying and the yowling and the carrying on. So again, doing intensive upfront loading really helps with those things. So you have to ask yourself, what is my goal? And if your goal is to decrease the population, you need to plan to front load. The other thing that you need to think about is then how do you front load? How do I, if I have a city of 500,000 cats, I can't really front load that very well. So that's where you have to really bring it back to what's the group of cats that you can manage that's a reasonable number, and what does that population look like? For the example in the video, we were looking at 50 cats, and then we brought it back down to 25 cats, so that was a little easier to manage on the video. But you may have 3 cats, you may have 20 cats. A lot of colonies are quite small. And if you look at it from that perspective, or from a neighborhood perspective, or from a single park perspective, you may be talking about fairly small numbers of cats that you can address. So thinking about what your goal is in the long term is going to be really important. From the perspective of some of the organizations and some of the folks who are here from spay-neuter clinics and animal shelters and veterinarians and the trappers, or the people who are doing it, you may have to, or you may wish to, if your goal is to decrease the population as quickly and humanely as possible, rethink how you're doing your trapping. Frame it into these small pieces. You may need to rethink who your priorities are for coming into your spay-neuter clinic if you're trying to do this kind of intensive front loading. And there's lots of good materials out there about doing mass trappings. There's lots of good materials about building these kinds of relationships and doing that kind of work. We know that we can bring in some of these cats who are socialized or young kittens and adopt them, but while that will reduce the population, in the long run, it actually costs way more and takes way more effort to reduce populations by removing cats. So that kind of adoption that some of us have the opportunity to do should really be viewed as kind of a stopgap where it's being done in concert with sterilization. And especially in this time where we don't have as many resources for spay-neuter. So just things to think about. What are your goals and what are they long-term? And how are we thinking about those relative to the welfare of the individual cats, as well as future cats and cats living longer term in these colonies? And that's it for me. We're going to toss it back to Stacy.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so I'm going to my first question is going to be for John, which is actually just a little bit of clarification. I think everybody was talking so fast that I think some of the stuff kind of, and can you clearly define what front loading is?
So yes, let's imagine that your goal is to eventually reach 80% sterilization and then keep it there. You can envision doing that different ways. You can envision saying, okay, I'm going to do 10 cats every 6 months and just keep doing that until eventually, slowly, I get up to 80%. That's one way to do it. Let's imagine we're talking about those 100 cats again. That will take some time because you do your first 10%, then you come back, you do your next 10 cats, and that'll add up over time, but it will take a while. The other way to do that is to say, okay, I'm going to try to get up to 80% by really concentrating my effort fast and then keep it there. Okay, so an intensive effort up front in this longer term process. The difference is, and sometimes it seems attractive to try to approach this higher rate of sterilization bit by bit. Sometimes that's all you can do. But the consequence of that is that as the years go by, you'll actually end up having to do more sterilizations than you will if you really concentrate your effort hard right up at the first and get that sterilization rate to a high level. And there's sort of a mathy explanation for why that works. But the faster you can get cats, most of your cats, to a point where they can't have kittens, then all of their kittens are kittens that you don't have to sterilize in the future, if that makes sense. So front loading just means how you apportion your effort. And while it sometimes seems like, getting back to what Margaret said a little bit, sometimes, it can seem maybe just too much to ask of us to try to front load. to put all that effort in at a given year at the beginning in order to get the benefits of it over time, but you can re-envision the population you're going to apply that to. Let's say you're thinking about, again, 100 cats that you want to deal with over the longer term. 80% sterilization all up front means you're doing 80 cats all at once, right? If that seems like too much, maybe you can divide those 100 cats into groups of 25. Focus on that first 25, get that to 80% fast, then keep it that way with a little bit of ongoing effort and move to the next 25 cats. If you do the math on that, over time, you'll end up doing fewer spay-neuter surgeries over 10, 15 years than you would if you were just doing a little bit everywhere all at once and slowly building up your sterilization rate.
So I'm gonna then move over to Peter for just to follow up on that. You know, you very eloquently shared the story of your own personal colony that you're working with, and you know, and luckily we're at a time and age where you were able to find resources for the 3 litters of kittens that you have. How do you think you would have felt if you had been dealing with a colony that you had not had any sterilization activity with? I mean, emotionally and, you know, just through this whole period of time, you know, what would you have, you know, how would you approach that? Because I think that's the big worry out there right now, is really the untouched colonies and what sort of impacts we're going to be feeling in those areas, and the thoughts that, you know, life is not so easy for those kittens that are not, you know, that normally we would hopefully have a chance at getting them sterilized. Now they're really going to have a tough time out there. So just wondering, I know you're a passionate cat trapper out there, and you know, you're an advocate for those cats, and sort of, you know, how have you felt through this whole process?
Probably the best way to begin to answer your question is to say I'm pretty poor at taking my own advice. So I will reframe your question and say, if someone came to me with the scenario that I just described, what advice would I give them? Because I feel like right now, we, myself and the other 2 individuals who are involved, we're doing everything, right? We are fostering the kittens that have been pulled. We're chasing the holdout kittens. We have in our sights, I mean, we've got the appointments already lined up for the moms who gave birth. In addition, over the course of chasing those kittens, guess what? We found more cats and more kittens, and we're chasing them. And we're really, really spread thinly here. If we didn't have the same resources that available to us, we would, I think, necessarily have to really laser focus on the low-hanging fruit, right? There is, for example, there's one mother who has at least 2 kittens. She's moved them multiple times. She's just very, very savvy. And even now we're looking at the situation, those guys might grow up in the neighborhood, right? Those might be TNR when we can get them, and there they stay. And that's really the best we can do. Had we not had the resources, there might be 2 moms like that or 3 moms like that out there. And as I kind of alluded to, this particular pocket in this neighborhood, there are a couple grumpy people about the cats. So that definitely, that would have created even more stress, the notion of any of those cats being out there, compared to the current scenario where we can go to them and legitimately say, we've got these records showing these many cats, this number has been spayed or neutered, this many kittens have been removed, and they're able to see in fairly short order a rapid change in that population, in that pocket of the neighborhood. But I fully appreciate that I have options that a lot of folks simply do not have.
Can I just add a little bit to that?
You may, go right ahead.
And I think that's a really nice lead in, that, you know, we can only do what we can do. It doesn't mean we can't aspire to do more TNR or aspire to keep it small so we can get on top of it quickly. And it also doesn't mean that we can't think about all the different ways that we could be involved. And we were talking earlier about the idea that, you know, someone has to trap and someone has to do this and someone has to do that, and those relationships are important. And COVID has made it in some places where it's hard to go out and feed cats. but we shouldn't forget all of the things that we know about relationships and about bringing people in and helping people help with TNR and cats and kittens. So that those kinds of networks are even more important now, but they've always been important.
I agree. I mean, I think about the situation in Newburyport. You know, Newburyport, there's really not much conversation about overpopulation of cats, you know, free roaming cats, because it's not an issue. And so if we could have the trap neuter return to the levels that we're talking about here, you know, for every pocket that's out there and have no black holes, that would be our dream world. And yes, Margaret, I aspire to that. I aspire to having, you know, all of the United States to, you know, have every free roaming cat named Adam and Eve, spayed and neutered. So, you know, and so, you know, I'll ask another question too, from a front loading question. And maybe John, you can think about this, and you can certainly say, I haven't thought about this, and maybe it's a consideration. But when I think of front loading, I actually think about the cats that are owned, and ensuring that those cats are spayed and neutered as a front loading. And maybe is there some way for us to look at that population ahead of time, so that then if they do get outside, either are community owned or semi-owned, however you want to call it, 4 paws on the pavement, they are coming out that front door spayed or neutered first, and what impacts that would be. When I've done programs in communities, I've done a lot of population of owned cats with the assumption that some of them are going to get outside, but yet they're going to be spayed or neutered first. Do you have any thoughts on that tactic, John?
Absolutely. It probably varies from place to place, but in many places, maybe most places, some meaningful portion of what we think of as outdoor cats are owned cats that are allowed outside some of the time or all of the time. And if all of those cats start out being spayed or neutered, then you're ahead of the game. You've got that many percentage of your effective outdoor cat population that's already been fixed. And so you've got a head start by virtue of that. So absolutely, when we talk about in these models our free roaming cats, we don't really distinguish between the ones that are unowned community cats versus owned cats that are out there involved with the unowned community cats. But we know that both of those groups contribute to the overall outdoor cat population.
Margaret, do you have any follow-up to that? Or Joyce, I see your hand is up. Did you want to say something?
Okay, I was just going to mention that our model does assume some immigration and abandonment of cats that are in the area, as you saw in that. And in our model, they are all fertile. They are not coming into that being sterilized already, which could be a worst case scenario. But we wanted to make sure that we had the ability to ward off, you know, the realization that they could be adding to the kitten population.
Right.
And those owned cats who are intentionally or unintentionally ending up on the street who are fertile are a huge impediment to getting ahead of the curve in spaying and neutering the existing cats. So your point about getting as many owned cats as possible spayed and neutered is really, really important, because then there is a body that gets added, but there's only the one. So it's a much better scenario and much easier to manage.
Well, and easier to coordinate getting to the spay neuter clinic, because usually it's the owners who are getting them there. So it's not this coordinated major sort of TNR effort, which, you know, does involve a lot of work in some scenarios. So, so I have a question here, and I will address this question to Margaret. As a shelter that offers a TNR service for community trappers, what can we do to help trappers right now? Are there specific things that help? Maybe supplying food, redirecting our volunteers to do transport. So if assuming that the spay neuter services aren't fully up and running and they're not able to do TNR, you know, what's sort of the supportive care out there that we can do?
Peter, do you want to actually take that?
Sure. Food's always nice. I mean, people ask me sometimes how much I spend on feeding these cats, and I deliberately haven't calculated it because it'll just make me feel bad. it does add up. So that certainly is, and even the, going to a food bank or a depot or something like that, that also, I think, helps solidify those networks, those relationships, right? So feeling like you're part of a larger cause and all the rest of it. So I think that's important too. I think the other piece of it that I would, I'm not even sure what the how looks like, but what I would encourage is help there, and God bless them, I think there should be a national holiday for the people who do the caregiving and the trapping. I mean, I do a little bit in my backyard, basically, right? But to the extent that they can have their efforts be more targeted, because there are definitely trappers who are, kind of guns for hire. And again, God bless them. They'll go wherever someone asks for their help. They'll drive across town. They'll, again, cannot, thank them enough. And I'm reluctant to criticize. But if you're the shelter and you really want to get the most bang for the buck, the greatest return on whatever investment you're making, it's important to target. And so encourage them. And again, part of that can be sort of the takeaways from this kind of population modeling, the importance of front loading, the importance of intensity rather than, and we've probably all seen Brian Cordes' presentations going back a number of years now about, sprinkling the surgeries over an entire zip code versus targeting in a few 10 groups of 10 cats or something like that. So I think, and especially the shelters in maybe a good position to do that, have it be sort of the knowledge hub of like, this is where we can disseminate information. We can talk about evidence-based practices, those sorts of things. Plus food.
And the other piece to that, I think, is the idea that it costs money to hire trappers, and it depends on exactly what your costs are. But some of our modeling work has looked at estimated average costs, and it turns out that hiring somebody doesn't cost you very much more in the long term, because it allows you to do that kind of targeting and that kind of intensive work and really get in there and get on top of it. And that means you're going to be handling way fewer cats in the long run. So it actually can be cost effective. So we also know that trapping can be hard for people, and depending on your location, especially inner city, transport can be really brutal. So depending on the shelter's location, those services may really facilitate the folks who actually have the cats getting them in for surgeries when surgeries are available.
So I'm actually going to take this time to do a quick poll, another poll. This was a question: have you used magistral acetate to prevent unwanted births? So it's a quickie yes, no, and I don't even know what that is. So we have 5% yes, 91% say no, and 5% don't know what it is. So Joyce, maybe can you share what it is for those of the group that don't know, and
Sure.
share if you know anything, if anybody's been using them or not.
Yeah, yes, of course. So magistral acetate is an oral contraceptive for cats. It is compounded here in the States. It's not something that's been approved by the FDA for use for veterinary purposes. It is approved in some other countries, and we have essentially pretty much not been a country that has been particularly interested in that, because we all want everybody to spay, just to surgically sterilize their cats, and we're very supportive of that. So when we looked at what might serve as an emergency stopgap, that came to the forefront for a number of reasons. It is quite affordable. You can get it through a veterinary compounder here in this country, so it's because it's used for human purposes and it's accessible. And so we have quite a lot on our website about this possibility for consideration. So if you just go to www.acc-d.org, it'll say COVID information, click there, and you'll find a lot of resources. We have always been pretty skeptical about this for free-roaming cat populations. It was used about 10 years ago by a Connecticut-based veterinarian under the name Feralstat. This powder was mixed with a milk compound and it was put into the food. But as we've looked at, and there's very little data on the dosage that was used for feral cats based on that. However, there's been more data on a really good low dose alternative for cats, and it's probably fairly safe to use it at the extremely micro doses that it was used for feral cat colonies. So while we clarify that you really need to be able to have a female cat get a single dose once a week to know that she's getting it for this to be safe and effective, there may be people that are working with free roaming cats who feel they could do that, and it really ought to be the decision of that person and the veterinarian that would be prescribing this for them. So yeah, so that's kind of the basics of it. One thing I can update that we will be doing is we're going to be putting out a survey probably at the end of June to connect. We have about 133 people so far that have opted into research that I believe are going to be using it, and we're looking for others who might be. So we hope to really learn a lot about how this experience went for people who are dealing with cats during this spay gap. The ones I've know that have used it have mostly been people who are placing intact female cats in new adoptive homes or in foster, and they're giving this to them until they can get them back in for a spay. And that's been the most of the utility, but I imagine some people are also using it in the field. So for those of you who have been working with using it, we'd love to know what your experience has been, and we'll be putting out a survey to help you give us a lot of that data. So please check out our website for more resources around it.
Great. So I'm going to actually do one last poll because this is going to address one question that I have that may be interesting for all of us. So this is a poll I do every pop-up panel. How long do you feel we'll be dealing with this? This meaning our coronavirus, COVID-19 sort of environment. So how long will we be in this? Are we looking at back to normal in 1 to 2 months, back to normal in 3 to 4 months, back to normal in 5+ months, or too long to even think about right now? So, and this is a very interesting poll. Kristen, I want to hear your microphone go right on right now because this poll changes every time we do it.
I feel like it's the best indicator of all the polls to kind of see where people are at. I love seeing the numbers change.
Yeah, I'm going to share the results with everybody. So how long do you feel we'll be dealing with this? 1 to 2 months, 5%. Nobody says 3 to 4 months. 5+ months, 36%. Too long to even think about right now. We just don't know, 59%. I can tell you when we first started this, the majority was at 1 to 2 months. And it has fully shifted to the we don't even know anymore. I got to start having a longer span on my poll. So that has changed dramatically since we started these back in March or early April, somewhere in that point in time. And so I would say the moral of the story is make every spay neuter appointment that you have count. Would you not agree? And so Peter, with that in mind, you'll be making sure to get as many appointments as you can at this point in time.
And we're going after the kittens tonight, and we've got appointments on the calendar. I mentioned we're in Arizona. Since we've started opening up, the number of cases, hospitalizations has spiked. So it's not entirely unrealistic to think that we could start losing appointments again.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone on the panel, Margaret, do you have any last thoughts before we close out? We have 2 minutes left.
No, well, I think just consider how you can make your spay neuter appointments count and prioritize those, and recognize that there's trade-offs. And getting that one boy cat who's causing a lot of mischief and mayhem and pissing off the neighbors might be worth it, even though he's not going to decrease your population. And you have to make that call and those decisions. Or if you catch one of those really wily female cats, she's got to be the first one to go in. So, and I'm less concerned about the kittens because we have a few months to get them spayed and neutered, so we can keep an eye out on them and keep them contained and confined for several months before we really have to start working on getting them sterilized.
John, any final thoughts?
No, just thanks everybody for attending. Our group is always available and ready to help folks who want to use some of the tools we're developing. So don't hesitate to contact us if we can help.
Peter, anything last from you?
Just to follow up on Margaret's thought about like how do you get the most out of those appointments? Having more tools and tricks, whether that's drop traps, like you've got the webinar coming up about the drop trap, whether it's, I mean, we're lucky we're able to leave the traps open and feed in the traps ahead of time, which is far more effective than just putting the traps out there to eating your trapping. So I mean, you really need to have a deep toolbox in order to maximize. If you've got 2 appointments, you got to make them count.
Yeah.
And Joyce, any last thoughts from you?
I think my colleagues have all said it really well. I just want to wish everybody the best of luck. I know these are trying times and you deal with a lot, and I'm very glad that for all the work that you do.